December 21, 1945. A general sits alone in his office. The war is over, but the man he needed most is gone. Dwight Eisenhower kept a photograph on his desk. Most people never noticed it. It wasn't of Roosevelt, or Churchill, or Marshall. It was George Patton. In uniform, pearl-handled pistols on his hips. That familiar scowl. For 30 years, they'd known each other. West Point, the Great War, the long years between. They'd ridden horses together across dusty parade grounds in Texas. Played cards in officers' quarters that smelled of boot polish and tobacco. Talked about war the way young men do, when war still seems glorious. But somewhere between those early days and the shores of Normandy, something changed. Eisenhower became the supreme commander. Patton became Patton. And the distance between them grew wider than the Atlantic. When Eisenhower took command of Allied forces in Europe, he inherited an impossible job. Keep the British happy. Keep the Americans advancing. Keep the Russians informed. Balance egos. Manage logistics. Win a war on 3 fronts while politicians back home second-guessed every decision. He needed men he could count on. Men who followed orders. Men who understood the bigger picture. And then there was George Patton. Brilliant. Unstoppable. Impossible. Patton didn't just fight the enemy. He fought the weather, the terrain, the supply system, his own headquarters staff. He fought Eisenhower's caution, Montgomery's ego, Bradley's careful planning. Sometimes it seemed like Patton fought the entire Allied command structure, because Patton believed in one thing above all else. Attack. Always attack. While other generals studied maps and worried about flanks, Patton was already moving. While they calculated risks, he was taking them. While they requested more supplies, he was improvising with what he had. Eisenhower admired it, envied it perhaps, but he also feared it. Because Patton's greatest strength was also his fatal flaw. He couldn't stop. North Africa taught Eisenhower what kind of general Patton was. After the disaster at Kasserine Pass, Eisenhower needed someone to restore American pride. He sent Patton. In weeks, the demoralized Second Corps transformed. Patton imposed discipline like a hammer. Fined men for not wearing helmets. Fired officers who showed weakness. Made them stand taller. Fight harder. Believe they were warriors. The Germans learned to respect the American army. Because they learned to fear Patton. But it came at a cost. Patton slapped a soldier. Called him a coward. In front of witnesses. Then did it again at another hospital. Another soldier suffering from combat fatigue. The press found out. Congressmen demanded his removal. The public called for his head. Eisenhower had a choice. Fire the general who won battles, or save the general who couldn't control himself. He chose to save him, but the price was humiliation. Patton apologized, publicly, to men he commanded. Something died in Patton that day. Not his fighting spirit, his trust. He never quite forgave Eisenhower for making him bend. Sicily was supposed to prove Patton's redemption. Instead, it revealed the growing divide. Montgomery got the glory road. The path to Messina. The path to headlines. Patton got the supporting role. Eisenhower's orders were clear. Let Montgomery lead. But Patton couldn't accept second place. He raced. Improvised. Ignored protocol. Beat Montgomery to Messina by hours. The British were furious. Eisenhower was caught in the middle. And Patton? Patton felt vindicated. He'd proven what mattered most. Speed. Aggression. Victory. But Eisenhower saw something else. Insubordination. Recklessness. A general who put personal glory above the alliance. After Sicily, Patton was sidelined. While other generals planned the invasion of France, Patton waited in England. A phantom army. A deception. A chess piece in Eisenhower's elaborate game to fool Hitler. Patton trained troops who would never fight under his command. Gave speeches to divisions that belonged to other men. Played the role of the warrior, while real warriors prepared for D-Day. It was the cruelest assignment Eisenhower could give. And Patton knew it. July 1944. 6 weeks after D-Day, the Allied advance had stalled. The hedgerows of Normandy became a maze of death. Every field a fortress. Every lane a killing ground. American boys died by the thousands for gains measured in yards. Eisenhower needed a breakthrough. He needed Patton. Third Army activated on August 1st. Patton finally had his command, and he exploded across France like nothing the Germans had ever seen. While other armies measured progress in miles per day, Patton measured it in miles per hour. His tanks raced. His infantry marched through the night. His supply trucks couldn't keep up. He captured towns the Germans still thought they held. Surrounded armies before they knew they were trapped. In 2 weeks, Third Army advanced further than any Allied force since D-Day. The German army in France collapsed. And Patton wanted more. Pause. He saw it clearly. The path to Berlin. The end of the war. Give him the fuel. Give him the supplies. Give him permission. He'd be in Berlin by Christmas. But Eisenhower said no. The British needed supplies. Montgomery had a plan. Market Garden. The bridge too far. Patton's tanks sat idle while British paratroopers died in Holland. It was the beginning of Patton's deepest frustration. Every time he built momentum, Eisenhower stopped him. Every time he saw opportunity, Eisenhower chose caution. Third Army could have ended the war in 1944. Patton believed it with every fiber of his being. And Eisenhower had stopped him. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Hitler's last gamble. The Battle of the Bulge. German panzers smashed through American lines. Surrounded the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. The Allied advance stopped. Reversed. Panic spread through headquarters. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting. Generals argued. Debated. Worried about how to respond. And Patton said something extraordinary. Pause. He could turn Third Army 90 degrees north and attack within 48 hours. In winter. In a snowstorm. Across unfamiliar terrain. 3 entire divisions. Tens of thousands of men. Hundreds of tanks. The other generals stared. Some laughed. It was impossible. Eisenhower knew better. Pause. He looked at Patton and asked how soon. Patton had already issued the orders. 72 hours later, Third Army slammed into the German flank. Relieved Bastogne. Shattered Hitler's offensive. Turned defeat into victory. It was the most brilliant operational maneuver of the war. And it saved Eisenhower's reputation. But when the photographers came, when the reporters wrote their stories, when the medals were awarded, it was Eisenhower who got the credit for steady leadership. Patton got a pat on the back and orders to keep advancing. The final months of the war revealed the full depth of their differences. Patton saw the Russians as the next enemy. Wanted to keep advancing. Wanted to beat them to Berlin. To Prague. To Vienna. Eisenhower saw politics. Agreements. Alliance obligations. When Patton's forces reached Czechoslovakia, he wanted to liberate Prague. Eisenhower ordered him to stop. The Russians had been promised Prague. Patton obeyed. Barely. But he never stopped talking. Never stopped pushing. Never stopped questioning. Why stop at the Elbe? Why let the Russians take Berlin? Why trust Stalin? He was right, of course. History proved him right. But in the spring of 1945, with Germany collapsing and the alliance fraying, Eisenhower couldn't afford a general who said the quiet part loud. There were moments when Eisenhower defended Patton fiercely. When Marshall suggested relief after the slapping incidents, Eisenhower refused. When politicians demanded Patton's court-martial, Eisenhower absorbed the pressure. When newspapers called Patton a brute, Eisenhower issued statements praising his tactical genius. But privately, the relationship was dying. Every time Patton succeeded, he reminded Eisenhower of roads not taken. Every time Patton spoke out of turn, he created problems Eisenhower had to solve. Every time Patton's name appeared in headlines, it was usually for the wrong reasons. After Germany surrendered, Eisenhower gave Patton command of the 15th Army. It sounded important. It wasn't. 15th Army's job was writing the history of the war, studying what had happened. For George Patton, the man of action, it was a prison sentence. He'd conquered half of Europe. Now he filed reports. Then came the press conference. Pause. A reporter asked Patton about denazification, about rebuilding Germany. Patton said something unforgivable. He compared Nazi Party membership to being a Republican or Democrat back home. Just politics, he said. Nothing more. The backlash was immediate. Savage. Eisenhower had no choice this time. Pause. On October 2, 1945, he relieved Patton of command. Their last meeting was brief, professional, cold. 30 years of friendship ended in a few sentences. Patton saluted, turned, left. He never commanded troops again. It was supposed to be a hunting trip. Patton loved Germany, loved the history, the castles, the forests. On the morning of December 9th, he left his headquarters near Mannheim. His aide drove. They were looking for pheasant. The roads were slick. Visibility poor. At 11:45 a.m., an army truck turned suddenly. Patton's car swerved. Not fast. Maybe 35 miles an hour. The collision was minor. A fender bender. The kind of accident that happens 100 times a day. But Patton's head snapped forward. Hit something. No one quite knew what. When they pulled him from the car, he couldn't move his legs. Pause. His neck was broken. The doctors at the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg did everything they could. Traction. Stabilization. Round-the-clock care. Patton knew. He told his wife Beatrice. Told the doctors. He wasn't going to make it. He'd survived 2 world wars. Cavalry charges in Mexico. Tank battles in France. The entire German army trying to kill him. And he was going to die from a car accident. In peacetime. On a German road. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 12 days he held on. His body was paralyzed. But his mind remained sharp. He dictated letters. Received visitors. Made jokes. But he was fading. Pause. On December 21st, at 5:50 p.m., his heart stopped. George S. Patton Jr. was 60 years old. The news reached Eisenhower in Washington. He was at his desk, working late, the way he always did. An aide brought him the message. General Patton died this afternoon. Eisenhower read it, set it down, dismissed the aide, and sat alone in his office. Pause. For a long time, the public funeral was everything Patton would have hated. Formal, somber, political, generals in dress uniforms, speeches about sacrifice and service, a flag-draped coffin. Patton was buried in Luxembourg, among the men he'd led, the soldiers of Third Army. He would have liked that part, at least. Eisenhower didn't attend. People noticed. Some understood. Most didn't. The official reason was duty, obligations, the demands of his position. But the truth was simpler. Pause. Eisenhower couldn't face it. In the months that followed, something changed in Eisenhower. He'd always been careful with his words, diplomatic, measured. But when people asked him about Patton, about their relationship, about the decisions made during the war, something broke through. He started telling the truth. Not the public truth. Not the careful truth designed for newspapers and memoirs. The real truth. Pause. In private conversations, Eisenhower admitted what he'd never said while Patton lived. That Patton was right about the Russians. That stopping at the Elbe was a mistake. That letting Stalin take Berlin handed him half of Europe. Patton had seen it, warned about it, begged to keep advancing. And Eisenhower had said no. Pause. Because he was thinking about alliance politics, about post-war stability, about things that seemed important at the time. But Patton was thinking about the next war. And Patton was right. Eisenhower admitted something else. That Patton could have ended the war in 1944. If Third Army had gotten the supplies, the fuel, the support. If Market Garden's resources had gone to Patton instead of Montgomery. If Eisenhower had trusted the warrior instead of the plan. Germany might have fallen 6 months earlier. Tens of thousands of American lives saved. The Holocaust shortened. The Cold War prevented. All the what-ifs of history. And they all pointed back to one decision. Pause. Eisenhower's decision to stop Patton. But the deepest admission came years later. When Eisenhower was writing his memoirs. Reflecting on the war. On the men he'd commanded. Someone asked him who was the best battlefield commander of World War II. Eisenhower didn't hesitate. Pause. George Patton. Not Montgomery with his careful set pieces. Not Bradley with his methodical advance. Patton. In pure combat leadership, in the ability to take ground and destroy the enemy, Patton had no equal. And Eisenhower had spent half the war holding him back. Pause. Because Patton's genius came with a price. He couldn't be controlled. Couldn't be managed. Couldn't be trusted to stay within the lines. And Eisenhower's job wasn't to unleash genius. It was to win a war while keeping an alliance together. But late at night, alone with his thoughts, Eisenhower wondered. Pause. What if he'd chosen differently? After Patton's death, Eisenhower started writing letters. Not official correspondence. Not documents for the historical record. Personal letters. To Patton. Pause. He never sent them, of course. How could he? But he wrote them anyway. In his private journals. On scraps of paper found years later. They revealed a man wrestling with guilt. With regret. With the impossible choices of command. In one letter, Eisenhower wrote about the slapping incident. How he'd wanted to defend Patton completely. Tell the press and the politicians to go to hell. But he couldn't. The alliance was too fragile. American public opinion mattered. So he'd humiliated his friend to save his career. Pause. And never explained why. He wrote, "You thought I sacrificed you for politics. Maybe I did. But I was trying to save you, George. Even if you never believed it." In another letter, Eisenhower wrote about the decision to give supplies to Montgomery instead of Patton in September 1944. He admitted it was wrong. Pause. Not strategically. Not politically. Not in terms of alliance management. But in terms of winning the war. Patton could have been in Berlin by Christmas. Could have ended it before the Battle of the Bulge. Before tens of thousands more died. And Eisenhower had stopped him. Because he was afraid of what Patton might do. Afraid of the risks. Afraid of losing control. He wrote, "You were ready to win the war. I was ready to manage it. History will judge which mattered more." The most painful letter was about their last meeting. October 2, 1945. When Eisenhower relieved Patton of command. Eisenhower described how Patton had stood at attention. How his face revealed nothing. How the salute was perfect. How they'd both pretended it was just another military formality. But Eisenhower knew better. He'd seen Patton's eyes. Pause. Betrayal. That's what they showed. Not anger. Not defiance. Betrayal. Because Patton had believed, despite everything, that Eisenhower would always have his back. And in that final meeting, Patton learned the truth. Eisenhower wrote, "I chose my career over our friendship. I chose political survival over loyalty. You deserved better, George. You deserved the truth. That I needed you more than I ever admitted. That I was never half the soldier you were. That sending you home was the most cowardly thing I ever did. June 1947. Nearly 2 years after Patton's death. The Army War College invited Eisenhower to speak about leadership in combat. He accepted. The audience expected the usual speech. Victory in Europe. Allied cooperation. The triumph of planning and logistics. But Eisenhower gave them something different. Pause. He talked about George Patton. There are 2 kinds of generals, Eisenhower said. Those who win wars in conference rooms. And those who win them on battlefields. I was the first kind. George Patton was the second. The room went silent. Pause. History will remember me as Supreme Commander. The man who orchestrated D-Day. Who held the alliance together. Who defeated Nazi Germany. But here's what history might forget. Every mile we advanced. Every German division we destroyed. Every town we liberated. Someone had to actually do it. Someone had to look young men in the eye and tell them to attack a machine gun nest. Someone had to improvise when the plans failed. Someone had to keep moving forward when everyone else wanted to stop. That was George Patton. Pause. Eisenhower's voice changed. Became softer. More personal. I spent 3 years trying to control him. To harness his aggression. To make him fit into my strategy. And I succeeded. But every time I did, I wonder now, did we lose something? Did we sacrifice speed for safety? Did we choose coordination over victory? Did we let politics override military judgment? He paused. The audience waited. Pause. Patton believed the war could have ended in 1944. That we could have driven to Berlin. That we could have beaten the Russians there. I told him no. I had my reasons. The alliance. The logistics. The risks. But he was right. Pause. The room erupted in murmurs. An admission like this, from Eisenhower, was unprecedented. I don't say this to diminish what we accomplished. We won. Germany surrendered. That matters. But I wonder what might have been. If I'd trusted George's instincts. If I'd given him the fuel and the freedom. If I'd been willing to take his risks. Another pause. Longer this time. George Patton was impossible to work with. Brilliant and infuriating in equal measure. He disobeyed orders. Ignored protocol. Said things that made my job harder. But he won battles. Every time. Against any odds. And I miss him. Pause. The audience sat stunned. Eisenhower, the unflappable Supreme Commander, was openly grieving. When I heard he died, my first thought was relief. God forgive me for that. But it was. No more problems. No more controversies. No more having to defend him or rein him in. My second thought was regret. Because I realized something. George Patton made me better. His aggression balanced my caution. His boldness balanced my planning. His absolute certainty balanced my doubts. We were opposites. We drove each other crazy. But together, we were effective. And I fired him. Pause. Because he embarrassed me. Because he made my job harder. Because I was tired of fighting for him. I told myself it was necessary. That the army needed stability. That Patton's time had passed. But the truth is simpler. I was jealous. Of his clarity. His confidence. His freedom to just be a warrior. I had to be a diplomat. A politician. A manager. He got to be a soldier. Pause. Eisenhower's voice grew stronger. If George Patton were here today, I'd tell him something I never said while he lived. You were right about the Russians. Right about Berlin. Right about finishing the war when we had momentum. You were the best combat commander I've ever seen. And I held you back because I was afraid of what you might do. That was my failure. Not yours. The audience was completely silent now. War needs men like me. Someone has to coordinate, plan, manage the politics. But war is won by men like George Patton. Men who see the enemy and attack. Who create opportunities instead of waiting for them. Who understand that in war, aggression and speed matter more than perfect plans. I knew that. I couldn't admit it. Because admitting it meant admitting I wasn't the warrior. I was just the manager. Pause. Eisenhower looked down at his notes. Then pushed them aside. When they buried George in Luxembourg, I wasn't there. I told people I was too busy. That duty called. The truth is, I couldn't face it. Couldn't face his widow. Couldn't face the men of Third Army. Because I knew what they knew. What I'd finally admitted to myself. We didn't just lose a general. We lost the general. The one who should have led us to Berlin. The one who would have stared down the Russians. The one who might have prevented the mess we're in now. And I'm the one who stopped him. Pause. The speech ended there. No rousing conclusion. No call to action. Just honesty. Raw, painful, honest. The Army War College never officially recorded that speech. But the officers who were there never forgot it. Word spread quietly. Through the ranks. Through the officer corps. About the day Eisenhower finally told the truth about George Patton. 1963. Eisenhower was in his 70s. Retired. Living in Gettysburg. A young historian came to interview him. Working on a book about World War II generalship. They talked for hours. About D-Day. The Bulge. The race across France. Finally, the historian asked the question. Pause. General, if you could go back and change one decision from the war, what would it be? Eisenhower didn't answer immediately. He stood. Walked to the window. Looked out at the Pennsylvania countryside. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. Pause. I'd unleash Patton in September 1944. Give him everything he asked for. Let him drive to Berlin. The historian waited. Eisenhower continued. People think I was the architect of victory. The strategic genius. The man who beat Hitler. But the truth? The real truth? Pause. George Patton won the war. I just managed not to lose it. He saw the battlefield clearly. Without politics. Without complexity. Just, where is the enemy, how do I kill him, how do I get there fastest? I saw problems. Variables. Risks. Consequences. The world needed my vision to plan the invasion. To hold the alliance together. To get us to the starting line. But once the whistle blew, once the fighting started, the world needed his vision. His instinct. His ruthlessness. And I kept getting in his way. Pause. The historian asked another question. Do you think General Patton understood how much you valued him? Eisenhower turned from the window. His eyes were wet. Pause. No. I don't think he did. I criticized him publicly. Relieved him twice. Sent him home in disgrace. I did it to save his career. To protect him from himself. To keep him in the fight. But he thought I betrayed him. And maybe I did. Because I chose the alliance over him. I chose Montgomery's feelings over Patton's judgment. I chose political stability over military effectiveness. Were those the right choices? I thought so at the time. But every time I see the Iron Curtain dividing Europe, every time I hear about Soviet tanks in Budapest or Prague, every time I think about the Cold War we're trapped in, I wonder what would have happened if I'd just let George go. Let him race to Berlin. Let him finish it. Another long pause. Pause. He'd have caused problems. Diplomatic nightmares. Stalin would have been furious. But we'd have had Berlin. We'd have had Prague. We'd have ended the war on our terms, not theirs. George saw that. I didn't. Or I did, and I just didn't have the courage to support him. The historian asked one more question. General, do you think Patton forgave you? Eisenhower shook his head slowly. Pause. I don't know. He died before we could talk. Really talk. Our last conversation was in my office. I was relieving him of command. Again. He stood at attention. Saluted. Said, "Yes, sir." But his eyes said everything. Disappointment. Anger. Betrayal. I told myself I was doing the right thing. That Patton had gone too far. That I had no choice. But the truth is, I was tired. Tired of defending him. Tired of the controversies. Tired of the political headaches. So I took the easy way out. I sent him home. 3 months later he was dead. Eisenhower's voice broke slightly. Pause. I never got to tell him the truth. That he was right. About the Russians. About Berlin. About finishing the job. That I was wrong. To stop him. To prioritize politics over victory. To let my fear override his instinct. That he was the best combat commander I ever knew. That I needed him. That the army needed him. That America needed him. I never got to say any of that. And now I never can. Pause. Eisenhower died in 1969. When they cleaned out his personal study, they found that photograph still on his desk. George Patton. Pearl-handled pistols. That fierce, determined scowl. On the back, in Eisenhower's handwriting, were 5 words. Pause. I should have trusted him. History remembers Eisenhower as the supreme commander who won World War II. It remembers Patton as the brilliant, controversial general who raced across Europe. But the real story, the one Eisenhower finally admitted in the years after Patton's death, was more complicated. It was the story of 2 men who needed each other. The planner and the warrior. The diplomat and the fighter. The manager and the genius. Together, they defeated Nazi Germany. But separated, by death and regret and words left unsaid, they became something else. Pause. A reminder that even the greatest victories carry the weight of roads not taken. Of chances missed. Of truths spoken too late. Eisenhower spent the last years of his life carrying that weight. Not publicly. Not in his official memoirs or presidential speeches. But privately. In letters never sent. In speeches that went off script. In quiet conversations with historians. He admitted what he'd never admitted during the war. That Patton was right. That Patton should have been unleashed. That political considerations, alliance management, and careful planning mattered. But not as much as he'd thought. That in war, the warrior's instinct sometimes trumps the general's strategy. Pause. And that the best decision he never made was trusting George Patton completely. December 21, 1945. A general sits alone in his office. The war is over. The victory won. The future uncertain. And the man he needed most is gone. Pause. Eisenhower picks up the photograph. Studies that familiar face. Those intense eyes. That unshakable certainty. And he finally understands what he should have known all along. Some men are born to plan wars. Others are born to win them. Pause. George Patton was born to win them. And Eisenhower had spent 3 years making sure he couldn't. The truth Eisenhower finally admitted wasn't comfortable. It wasn't heroic. It didn't make him look good. But it was honest. Pause. He'd been a great supreme commander. But Patton had been a better warrior. He'd managed the alliance brilliantly. But Patton had won the battles. He'd gotten them to Berlin eventually. But Patton could have gotten them there 6 months sooner. And those 6 months, those thousands of lives, that half of Europe lost to Soviet occupation, that was the price of his caution. Pause. In the end, Eisenhower's greatest admission wasn't about strategy or tactics. It was simpler than that. He'd had greatness under his command. Pure, undiluted, impossible greatness. And he'd been afraid of it. Afraid it would get out of control. Afraid it would cause problems. Afraid it would make him look weak. So he'd contained it. Managed it. Held it back. And the world would never know what might have been if he'd just let go. Pause. Let Patton be Patton. Let the warrior win the war his way. Let genius do what genius does. That was what Eisenhower finally admitted after Patton died. Not in press conferences or official statements, but in quiet moments, in letters to ghosts, in speeches that told uncomfortable truths. He admitted that sometimes the greatest leaders aren't the ones who make the best plans. They're the ones who know when to step aside and let someone else lead. Pause. And that was the one thing Eisenhower could never quite bring himself to do. Until it was too late. The photograph remained on his desk until the day he died. George Patton. Scowling at the camera. Pearl-handled pistols gleaming. Looking exactly like what he was. A warrior. Pause. The warrior Eisenhower needed. The warrior Eisenhower stopped. The warrior Eisenhower never stopped missing. And on the back, those 5 words. Written in private. Never meant for public eyes. Just a confession to himself. I should have trusted him. Pause. Sometimes the most important truths are the ones we admit too late. After the moment has passed. After the decisions are made. After the person is gone. Eisenhower spent the last quarter century of his life living with that truth. That George Patton was right. About almost everything. And that stopping him, containing him, sending him home, was the biggest mistake of the war. Pause. Not a military mistake. The Allies still won. But a human mistake. The loss of what might have been. The death of a friendship. The silencing of a voice that needed to be heard. And the question that haunted Eisenhower until his own death. What if? Pause. What if he'd trusted him?